There is a moment, and almost every human being on earth has lived it, when you are standing somewhere ordinary, a kitchen, a bus stop, a quiet room late at night, and something inside you shifts. The noise of the world goes still for just a second, and in that second, you feel something that you cannot quite name. It is not fear. It is not joy, exactly. It is something older than either of those words, something that makes you feel all at once incredibly small and strangely significant. You do not know where it came from. You do not know if it means anything, but you know without a single doubt that it was real. William James spent his entire life trying to understand that moment. He was not a preacher. He was not a mystic living in a cave on a mountain. He was a doctor, a philosopher, a scientist, a man who spent decades inside the best universities in the world, surrounded by laboratories and lecture halls and students who expected answers. He was someone who believed deeply in evidence, and yet he also believed that the most important experiences a human being can have are the ones that science, at least in its traditional form, has the hardest time explaining. He believed that religion and science were not enemies. He believed they were two different lanterns, both trying to light the same dark room. And that is what this book is really about. Not about choosing a side, not about winning an argument, but about something far more interesting, the attempt, honest and courageous, to hold two enormous ideas in one mind at the same time, without flinching, without pretending, and without giving up. So let us walk into that room together, let us pick up both lanterns, and let us see what we can find. William James was born in 1842 in New York City into a family that was, to put it gently, not ordinary. His father, Henry James Sr., was a restless, passionate theologian who believed that all organized religion had gotten things terribly wrong. His brother, Henry James Jr., would go on to become one of the greatest novelists the English language has ever produced. William himself suffered from depression, illness, and a deep personal crisis in his 20s, a period where he genuinely did not know whether life was worth living. He would later write about this crisis carefully and honestly, and his writing about it became one of the most important things he ever produced, because it was not the writing of someone who had never struggled. It was the writing of someone who had stood at the edge and looked down and then stepped back and then tried to understand exactly what had happened. That experience, that very human, very desperate, very real experience, shaped everything he wrote afterward, including the work that forms the foundation of this summary. He graduated from Harvard Medical School, became a professor there, and eventually founded what many people consider the first laboratory of experimental psychology in America. He was a scientist, a real one. He cared about evidence and method and rigor, but he also cared about something that many scientists of his era were starting to dismiss entirely: the inner life of the human being. The feelings, the visions, the prayers, the moments of sudden certainty that seemed to come from nowhere and change everything. He refused to throw those away. He insisted that they deserved the same honest, careful attention that a biologist gives to a cell, or that a physicist gives to the behavior of light. And so we begin. The first great tension that James explores, and it is a tension that every thoughtful person has wrestled with at some point, is the apparent conflict between the scientific worldview and the religious worldview. By the time James was writing and lecturing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this conflict had become loud and public. Darwin had published his theory of evolution. The geological record was reshaping humanity's understanding of time. Physics was unraveling the fabric of a universe that seemed more and more to operate according to cold and indifferent laws. For many intellectuals, this felt like a death blow to religion. If the universe runs on physics, they said, there is no room for God. If human beings evolved from simpler creatures, there is no soul. If everything can be explained by material causes, then prayer is just a person talking to themselves, and religious experience is just a quirk of brain chemistry. James heard all of this. He understood it. He respected the people making these arguments, but he thought they were moving too fast. Think about it this way. Imagine you are walking through a forest at night, and you have a flashlight. The flashlight is powerful. It illuminates a narrow path ahead of you with striking clarity. You can see every rock, every root, every puddle on that path. And so you say confidently, everything I need to know about this forest is on this path. Everything I cannot see does not matter. But the forest is enormous, and your flashlight, as good as it is still just a flashlight. James was not saying science is wrong. He was saying that science, as it was being practiced in his day, and as it is still sometimes practiced in ours, had a habit of treating its own method as the only method, of deciding that anything it could not measure did not exist, and he thought that was a philosophical mistake of enormous consequence, because it left out entire categories of human experience that were clearly real, clearly significant, and clearly telling us something important about the nature of things. He was particularly interested in what he called the varieties of religious experience. He spent years collecting accounts, from ordinary people, from mystics, from theologians, from people who had never set foot in a church but had felt something overwhelming in nature, or in the presence of a dying loved one, or in a moment of crisis so severe that their entire sense of self seemed to dissolve and then reform. He read hundreds of these accounts. He analyzed them, he compared them, he looked for patterns, and what he found was remarkable. Across cultures, across centuries, across wildly different theological frameworks, the experiences themselves were strikingly similar. The person feels a sudden sense of unity with something larger than themselves. The boundaries of the self seem to dissolve. Time feels different, either stretched or contracted or strangely irrelevant. There is an overwhelming sense of significance, of mattering, of being connected to something real and important. And there is often a quality that James described as noetic, meaning that the experience does not just feel good, it feels like knowledge. Like the person has learned something true, something they could not have arrived at through ordinary reasoning. Now, a strict materialist would say, fine, we understand this. The brain is doing something unusual. Perhaps serotonin levels shifted. Perhaps the default mode network, the part of the brain that constructs our sense of self, temporarily quieted. Perhaps it is nothing more than a neural event, and the sense of meaning is just an artifact of the way human brains are wired. And James would say, yes, that may be part of the explanation. But notice what you just did. You explained the mechanism. You did not explain whether the experience corresponds to something real. Those are two completely different questions. He used a beautiful analogy. He said that pointing to the biology of love and saying love is therefore not real is like pointing to the chemistry of music, the vibrations of air, the mechanics of the ear, and saying music is therefore not beautiful. The mechanism does not invalidate the meaning. The explanation of how does not automatically answer the question of what, and this was one of his most important philosophical contributions. He insisted again and again that the truth or value of an experience cannot be settled by explaining its origins. He called this the genetic fallacy, the mistake of thinking that by tracing how something arose you have settled the question of what it is. You have not. You have just added a chapter to the story. The question of meaning is still open. Now, let us slow down here, because this matters enormously in our own lives too. Think about a time when you had a feeling that changed you. Perhaps it was standing at the edge of the ocean and feeling something you could only call awe. Perhaps it was holding your child for the first time and knowing, in a way that went beyond words, that this was the most important thing that had ever happened to you. Perhaps it was a moment of grief so complete that it cracked you open and you found inside the crack something you had not known was there. Perhaps it was a moment of prayer or meditation, or sitting in silence in a cathedral, or watching the sun set over mountains, when something arrived, quiet, certain, enormous, and you felt just for a moment that you understood something true. Did you dismiss that? Did you say, well, that was just neurons? Did you file it away as interesting but ultimately meaningless? Or did you carry it with you? Did it change how you live? Did it change what you value? Most people carry those moments. Most people, no matter what they believe intellectually, treat those experiences as real, as events that actually happened, that carried actual information, that changed them in actual ways. And James thought that was correct. He thought that the near-universal human tendency to treat these experiences as significant was itself a piece of evidence. Not proof of any specific theology, but evidence that something is happening, something worth taking seriously, something that a complete account of human life cannot simply ignore. He was not naive about this. He knew that religious experience had been used to justify terrible things. He knew that people claimed divine authority for violence, for oppression, for every kind of cruelty. He took that seriously. He did not say all religious experiences are valid. He said they deserve the same critical scrutiny that we apply to any other kind of experience. We test scientific claims. We check them against other evidence. We ask whether they lead to good or bad consequences in the world. He thought the same standard should apply to religious and mystical claims. This is where his philosophy of pragmatism enters the picture, and it is a beautiful idea, misunderstood far more often than it is understood correctly. Pragmatism for James was not the cynical idea that truth is whatever works for you personally. That is a caricature. What he actually meant was something much more interesting and much more honest. He said that the truth of an idea is not some abstract floating property that it possesses independently of all human experience. Truth is something that happens to ideas when they engage with the real world. An idea is true, he said, if it leads us, in the long run, to experiences that fit, that cohere, that satisfy the full range of our needs. not just our practical needs, but our emotional, moral, and intellectual needs as well. And religious ideas, he argued, do work. Not in every case, not for every person, not without needing to be tested and sometimes revised, but in many cases the belief in something larger than yourself, the belief that your suffering has meaning, that you are connected to others and to something beyond the merely personal, changes people. It changes how they bear suffering. It changes how they treat strangers. It changes what they are willing to sacrifice for. And James thought that a philosophy honest enough to take human experience seriously had to reckon with that. He told a story, or rather, he drew on many stories, of people who had been broken by life, people who had lost everything, who had reached the end of what they thought they could bear, who had felt themselves disintegrate, and who had then, through some experience they could not fully explain, found themselves reconstituted, put back together. Not the same as before, better in some ways, larger, more open, more alive to the world. He called this twice-born, drawing on a distinction between those who move through life without ever having been truly shattered and those who have been shattered and rebuilt. He was not romanticizing suffering. He was noticing that something happens in the crucible of genuine crisis that does not happen any other way, and that religious experience in many cases is exactly what happens in that crucible. Now, let us talk about science for a moment, because James loved science. He was not one of those thinkers who pitted science and religion against each other and then quietly rooted for religion to win. He thought science was one of the greatest achievements of the human mind. He thought the scientific method, careful observation, hypothesis, testing, revision, was genuinely reliable in the domains where it applied. He was excited by the discoveries of his era. He paid attention to physics, to biology, to the emerging science of psychology. But he also saw with great clarity what science was not. It was not a complete philosophy of life. It was not a source of meaning. It was not capable by itself of telling a human being how to live. And it was not, and this is crucial, as settled and certain as its most confident advocates sometimes claimed. He was writing and lecturing at a time when science itself was on the verge of enormous revolutions. The certainty of classical Newtonian physics was about to be shattered by relativity and quantum mechanics. The confident materialism of the 19th century was about to discover that matter itself, at the smallest scales, behaves in ways that are deeply strange and genuinely uncertain. The universe, it turned out, was far weirder than anyone had imagined. James sensed this before it fully arrived. He had a philosophical instinct, a genuine intellectual humility, that told him that anyone who claimed to have the universe fully figured out was probably about to be surprised. And so he argued for what he called radical empiricism, a kind of openness, a commitment to taking all experience seriously, not just the experience that fits neatly into current theoretical frameworks. He argued that consciousness, itself, the fact that there is something it is like to be you, reading or listening to these words, is one of the great mysteries of the universe, and that a science which treats it as a trivial byproduct of neural activity is not being more rigorous, it is being less honest. It is sweeping an enormous mystery under the rug and pretending the floor is flat. Around the 10-minute mark in your listening experience, you might be wondering, is this relevant to me? Does all of this matter to my actual life in my actual world with my actual problems? Yes, deeply yes, because what William James was really writing about, underneath all the philosophy and the theology and the psychology, was the question of how to be a human being who takes life seriously. How to be honest. How to resist the temptation to take easy answers, either the easy answer of blind faith or the easy answer of cynical dismissal. How to sit with uncertainty and not collapse, but instead, let it open you up. How to take your own inner experience seriously without becoming self-indulgent. How to stay curious when everything inside you wants to close. There is a story, not from James directly, but from the tradition he belonged to, of a young philosopher who went to his teacher and said, "I have decided that nothing is certain." The teacher said, "Are you certain about that?" The young philosopher paused, and in that pause, everything was alive. James lived in that pause. He made his home there. And he invited his readers to join him. He thought that one of the great moral challenges of the modern age was the challenge of what he called the will to believe. He gave a famous lecture by that title, and it was controversial then, and it remains controversial now, because he seemed to be saying that sometimes, when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous, a person has the right, even the responsibility, to choose a belief on the basis of what it does for them, of what kind of life it makes possible. And his critics said, wait, that is just wishful thinking. That is just deciding to believe what you want to believe because it makes you feel better. But James was more precise than that. He was careful. He said this only applies in specific conditions. First, the question must be one that you cannot settle by gathering more evidence. It must be genuinely open. Second, the question must be a live one for you, meaning both options feel real, not abstract. Third, the question must be momentous. The stakes must be high enough that refusing to choose is itself a choice with real consequences. And fourth, refusing to commit also comes at a cost. If you stand back and wait forever for more evidence, you may miss the very thing that the commitment itself would have made possible. Think about love. You cannot know with certainty before you commit whether another person will prove worthy of your trust. You cannot run a controlled experiment. You cannot wait until all the evidence is in, because the evidence is never fully in. At some point you have to choose, and the choice itself shapes what becomes possible. The marriage that happens is a different thing than the marriage that might have happened if only the evidence had been clearer. James thought that faith, including religious faith, worked the same way in certain crucial respects. Not that evidence was irrelevant, not that you should believe anything you found comforting, but that in certain deep questions about the ultimate nature of things, the universe genuinely does not give us enough information to be certain, and that choosing to live as though the universe is meaningful, as though there is something larger than yourself that you are connected to, is not a failure of intelligence, it is a kind of courage. A bet placed with open eyes on the most important question of all. Now, let us talk about mysticism, because this is where James gets most interesting and, for some readers, most surprising. He took mystical experiences seriously, not as proof of any particular theology, but as data, as something that actually happens to human beings across every culture and every century, and therefore as something that any honest philosophy of mind and religion has to address. He identified 4 qualities that seemed common to genuine mystical states. The first he called ineffability. The experience is so intense and so unlike ordinary experience that ordinary language simply fails. You can gesture at it. You can say it was like falling into light, or like the world becoming transparent, or like everything being perfectly right. But the words are always shadows of the thing itself. The person who has had the experience knows this. The person who has not had it often finds the descriptions confusing or even absurd. And that asymmetry, that gap between the testimony and the ability of language to carry it, is itself interesting. It suggests that something real and unusual is happening, something that stretches at the edges of what human cognition normally does. The second quality is noetic. He used this word specifically. The experience feels like knowledge, like revelation. The person does not just feel good, they feel that they have understood something true, something about the nature of reality, about the relationship between self and world, about the presence of something important that ordinary consciousness is too busy or too narrow to perceive. The third quality is transience. These states do not last. They come and they go, sometimes in minutes, sometimes in an hour at most. They cannot be held on to. And this is actually one of the reasons James found them interesting rather than suspicious. People who are simply hallucinating tend to want more. The mystical experience, by contrast, leaves its mark not through repetition but through the transformation it produces. A single such experience can change a person permanently, even though the experience itself was brief. The fourth quality is passivity. Even when the experience is sought through prayer or meditation or fasting, when it arrives, it does not feel like something the person produced. It feels like something given, like being found rather than finding. This quality of grace, this sense that the experience comes from somewhere outside the ordinary self, is one of the things that makes it feel, to the person having it, like contact with something genuinely other. And James asked, very carefully, what should we make of this? He did not say, therefore God exists, in any specific theological sense. He was too careful for that, and too honest. But he did say that these experiences are among the most powerful and life-changing that human beings have. He said that dismissing them entirely, without serious engagement, is a kind of intellectual cowardice disguised as rigor. And he said that they point, at least, toward the possibility that human consciousness is not the sealed, isolated thing that the dominant materialist picture imagined it to be. They point toward the possibility that we are, somehow, connected to something larger than ourselves, that the boundaries of the self are not as solid as they seem in ordinary waking life. He was open about the fact that he himself had rarely experienced anything like a full mystical state. He had had moments, particularly after taking certain substances that were being studied by researchers in his era, of something approaching that quality of experience. He wrote about these honestly. He was not claiming personal authority from vision. He was doing what a good scientist does. He was examining the reports of others, looking for patterns, trying to understand what they meant. Let us talk about what this means for the relationship between religion and science, because that is the central question of this work. James thought that science and religion were answering different questions and that this was not a problem to be solved but a fact to be honored. Science, at its best, asks how. How does the physical world operate? What are the mechanisms? What are the regularities? How can we predict and explain and, where appropriate, intervene? These are genuinely important questions, and the scientific method is the best tool human beings have ever developed for answering them. But religion, at its best, asks why. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does suffering exist, and what should we do with it? Why does beauty move us? What do we owe each other? What is worth living for? How should we face death? These are also genuinely important questions, and they are not answered by the scientific method, not because the scientific method has failed, but because they are a different kind of question. They require a different kind of engagement. He thought that the tragedy of the late 19th century, and honestly the tragedy of our own moment too, was the tendency to let these two kinds of questions compete. To say, since science answers the how questions, religion has no standing at all. Or, conversely, to say that since religion answers the why questions, scientific findings about the how can be ignored or denied. Both of these moves seemed to James not just wrong but wasteful. They were throwing away important information. They were making life smaller than it needed to be. He wanted something larger. He wanted a human being and a culture that could hold both, that could say yes to the findings of biology and physics and neuroscience, and also say yes to the experience of awe in the presence of a mountain, or the experience of guilt when one has done something wrong, or the experience of love as something more than just a reproductive strategy. Not because these two kinds of yes require each other, but because they are both honest responses to the full reality of being human. He also had something interesting to say about the nature of God, or rather, about what a philosophically honest concept of God might look like in light of everything science and psychology and comparative religion had revealed. He was not a traditional theist. He was not comfortable with the idea of an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good deity who stands outside the universe and controls everything in it. That idea, he thought, ran into too many difficulties, most famously the problem of evil. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, why does so much suffering exist? Why do children get cancer? Why do famines and earthquakes and genocides happen? Traditional theology has answers to these questions, theodicies they are called. James knew them. He was not dismissive of them, but he thought they often failed the basic test of honest reckoning. They often felt like explanations designed to protect a prior conclusion rather than genuine attempts to follow the evidence where it leads. So he proposed something different. He proposed thinking about the divine, whatever it might be, as something finite, something real and powerful but not omnipotent. Something that, in a sense, needs us. Something that is working in and through the world but not standing above it and controlling it. Something more like a collaborator than a dictator. Something that is genuinely in the struggle with us, genuinely invested in whether things go well or badly, genuinely affected by what we do. This idea, which he called pluralistic theism, or meliorism, was and is controversial. Orthodox religious thinkers did not like it because it diminishes God. Orthodox atheists did not like it because it still posits something divine. But James thought it was more honest than either alternative. He thought it took the evidence seriously, the evidence of evil and suffering as real and unredeemed by some higher purpose, and also the evidence of genuine goodness and genuine transformation and genuine grace in human experience. He thought it left room for both without pretending to resolve what cannot be resolved. He also thought it had a very important practical consequence. If the divine is not omnipotent, then our choices actually matter. Not in some thin token sense, but really, genuinely, cosmically matter. The universe's outcome is not predetermined, it is being worked out, and we are working it out. And whether we act with courage or cowardice, with generosity or selfishness, with honesty or self-deception, makes a real difference to what becomes of things. That is a very different picture of moral life than the one painted either by strict determinism, where everything is fixed in advance, or by traditional divine sovereignty, where God's plan will unfold regardless of what we do. James's picture is one where the stakes are real, where the game is not rigged, and where what you do matters in ways that go beyond your own personal life. He used a beautiful image. He said, imagine a vast company of people cooperating on an enormous task, not a single conductor directing everything, not a machine running on predetermined tracks, but a genuine community of agents, each making real choices, each affecting the others, each contributing something that no one else can contribute in quite the same way. He thought the universe was something like that, and he thought human beings were genuinely participants in it, not spectators, not puppets, but actual agents whose decisions ripple out into the fabric of things. Now please like and subscribe to Audiobook Library. This kind of work takes real time and genuine care, and your support is exactly what helps this channel continue to bring you ideas that matter, voices that have been thinking deeply for centuries, distilled into something you can carry with you. Every subscribe, every like, every share helps more people find their way to ideas that deserve a wider hearing. Thank you, genuinely, for being here. Let us continue, because there is so much more. James was also deeply interested in what we might call the sick soul. His term, not a diagnosis, but a description of a particular kind of inner life. He drew a contrast between what he called the healthy-minded person and the sick soul. The healthy-minded person, he said, is able to see life primarily as good. They do not ignore evil, but they experience the goodness of life as more fundamental, more real, more primary than its darkness. They tend toward joy, toward optimism, toward a sense that things will work out. And James did not dismiss this. He thought it was a genuine and valuable disposition. He thought many religious traditions had cultivated it deliberately and wisely. But he also thought there was a kind of experience, a kind of honesty, that healthy-mindedness by itself could not reach. The sick soul, as he described it, is the person who cannot look away from the darkness. The person who knows, in their bones, that suffering is real and unredeemed and not always followed by growth. The person who has stood at the edge of despair, or fallen in, and knows what is down there. The person for whom optimism feels like a lie, not because they are weak, but because they are paying attention. He thought, and this is important, that the sick soul is in some ways closer to the full truth of things than the healthy-minded person. Not because pessimism is more accurate than optimism, but because the person who has genuinely wrestled with darkness, who has not been able to paper over it with easy reassurances, who has had to find some way to keep going in the full knowledge of how things can go, that person has access to a kind of depth that pure healthy-mindedness cannot reach. And he thought that the greatest religious figures, the ones who had actually changed history and changed hearts, were almost always twice born. They had been through something terrible. They had been shattered, and the faith that came out of that shattering was a different thing than the faith that had never been tested. It was tougher. It was more supple. It did not break as easily, because it had already broken once and had been put back together by something it could not fully name. There is something here for all of us, and I want to sit with it for a moment, because it is one of the most humanly important things in this entire work. There is enormous pressure in our culture to be fine, to be positive, to move on, to choose growth, to practice gratitude, and some of that is genuinely helpful. James himself believed in the power of acting as if, of choosing to inhabit the perspective that makes forward movement possible. But he also believed that there are times when the only honest thing is to name the darkness, to say, this is terrible and I do not know what it means, and I am not yet ready to call it growth. To sit in the truth of suffering without immediately rushing to the moral of the story, because sometimes, James thought, the moral comes later, and sometimes the thing that makes you whole again is not an explanation, it is an experience. A moment of grace, a sudden shift, something that cannot be forced or earned or manufactured, but that comes, when it comes, with the quality of gift. He thought that prayer, and he was honest that he was not sure what prayer was or what it connected to, was one of the ways human beings opened themselves to that kind of experience. Not by compelling the universe to do their bidding, not by following a formula, but by the act of genuinely turning towards something larger than themselves, honestly, vulnerably, without pretending to know how it would turn out. He thought that act had effects, psychological effects certainly, and perhaps more than psychological effects, that were worth taking seriously. He also had wise things to say about the institutional forms of religion, the churches, the creeds, the doctrines, the hierarchies. He was wary of them. He thought that organized religion as a sociological phenomenon had a tendency to crystallize what had begun as living experience into dead formula. The mystic has an experience. The disciples remember it. The memory becomes a doctrine. The doctrine becomes a creed. The creed becomes a test of membership. And by the time a few generations have passed, the original living experience is somewhere buried under layers of institution, and people are fighting wars over the formulation of words that once tried to point at something that words cannot capture. He did not think this was inevitable. He thought it was a failure of nerve, a failure of trust, a failure of willingness to keep the question open. He thought that real religion, real spirituality if you prefer that word, required a kind of perpetual recommencement, a perpetual willingness to return to the original experience, to the original question, to the original encounter with something that could not be fully contained by any institution. And he thought that science, at its best, had this quality. The best scientists, he noticed, had something that looked a lot like religious humility, a genuine openness to being wrong, a genuine reverence for the complexity and strangeness of what they were studying, a genuine willingness to be surprised. He thought this was not a coincidence. He thought that deep intellectual honesty, wherever it appears, has a certain family resemblance, a certain quality of openness to what is actually there, rather than what we expected or hoped to find. He wrote beautifully about the relationship between consciousness and the universe. He resisted what he called the block universe, the idea that everything is already settled, that the past and future are equally fixed, that time is an illusion and free will is a comfortable story we tell ourselves. He thought this picture, however logically compelling it might seem, was simply not consistent with the actual experience of human consciousness. We experience deliberation as real. We experience the future as genuinely open. We experience our choices as genuinely mattering. And James thought that a philosophy which told us this experience was entirely mistaken owed us a much better account of how the mistake arose than had yet been provided. He preferred what he called a universe of pure experience, a universe in which experience is not an epiphenomenon, not a mere shadow cast by physical events, but a genuine ingredient of what is real. This is a difficult idea, and philosophers have argued about it ever since he proposed it, but its spirit is clear enough. He was saying that the inner life is real, that the fact of consciousness is not a problem to be explained away, but a mystery to be honored, that a universe which contains experience is a different kind of universe than one that does not, richer, stranger, more interesting, and more open. Near the end of all these reflections, James returned always to the question of how we are to live, not in the abstract, not as a philosophical puzzle, but concretely, personally, today. He thought that the answer, insofar as there was one, lay in what he called the strenuous mood. He contrasted this with the easygoing mood, the disposition that says, whatever happens, things will work out fine, the universe is friendly, goodness will prevail. The easygoing mood is not all wrong, he thought, but it tends toward complacency. It tends toward a willingness to let hard things go unaddressed, difficult truths go unspoken, real suffering go unattended, because, things will work out. The strenuous mood is different. It is the disposition that says things might not work out. The universe might not be guaranteed to be friendly. Evil might be real and genuinely resistant to redemption. And therefore, what we do matters enormously. We cannot afford complacency. We cannot afford self-deception. We cannot afford the comfortable lie. We have to face things as they are, as honestly and as fully as we can, and then act, not because we are certain of success, but because the attempt itself is what makes us fully human. He thought this strenuous mood was, paradoxically, more available to people who had a religious commitment of some kind, even a modest one, even a tentative one. Because the strenuous mood requires the sense that what you do matters beyond your own personal life, that there is something larger at stake, that the universe or whatever lies at the heart of things is paying attention. Without some version of that sense, the strenuous mood tends to collapse into either nihilism, nothing matters, so why try, or into exhausted pragmatism, I will do my best, but I know it is all ultimately pointless. With some version of that sense, even uncertain, even questioned, even held lightly, the strenuous mood has roots, it has something to draw from. It can endure difficulty without collapsing, because it is not drawing only on personal resources but on something it believes to be larger and more persistent than any individual life. This does not mean, James insisted, that you have to sign on to any particular creed or institution or doctrinal formula. He thought many people had genuine spiritual lives that organized religion had failed to capture or contain. He thought the honest agnostic who faced the darkness without flinching and still chose to act with generosity and courage was, in some important sense, living a religious life, even without the name. He also thought that science, properly understood, could be part of that kind of life. Science at its best is a practice of honesty, a commitment to seeing things as they are rather than as we wish them to be. It is a practice of humility, a willingness to be wrong, to revise, to learn. It is a practice of patience, a willingness to stay with a question long enough for a real answer to emerge rather than settling for a comfortable approximation. These are not just scientific virtues, they are human virtues. And James thought that a person who practiced them fully, in all areas of their life, in their science, in their relationships, in their inner life, in their encounter with the great questions, was practicing something that deserved to be called wisdom. Let us also spend some time with the question of free will, because James cared about this question not as an abstract puzzle, but as a matter of urgent personal and moral significance. He had his crisis in his 20s, the period of depression and despair, and what pulled him out of it, at least in part, was a deliberate choice. He read a philosopher named Renouvier, who defined free will as the capacity to sustain a thought simply because one chooses to, when one might instead let it go. And James decided, in a now famous diary entry, to believe in free will, not because he had proven it, not because the philosophical arguments were conclusive, he knew they were not, but because the alternative, a determinism that made all his choices merely the inevitable products of prior causes, was incompatible with the kind of life he wanted to live. Incompatible, he thought, with the kind of life any thoughtful person could live without self-deception. He spent years afterward working out the philosophical implications of this choice. He argued that consciousness is not epiphenomenal, not just a shadow of physical events with no causal power of its own. He argued that the sense of deliberation, of weighing alternatives, of choosing between paths is a real feature of what is happening, not a post hoc narrative we tell ourselves. He argued that the universe is genuinely open in ways that make free will coherent rather than illusory. Now, the science of his time and of our time has complicated this. We know a great deal more about how the brain works than James did. We know that decisions seem to be preceded by neural activity that the conscious mind is not immediately aware of. We know that much of what we call choice may be better described as rationalization of processes that were already underway. This is serious. It does not dissolve the question, but it complicates it considerably. And I think James would have found this fascinating rather than threatening, because the question he was really asking was not a neuroscientific question. It was a philosophical one. He was asking what kind of universe we have to assume in order for the things that actually matter to us, moral responsibility, the reality of our choices, the significance of how we act, to be genuinely what they seem to be. And he thought the answer required some version of genuine openness in the structure of things, some genuine indeterminacy, some genuine room for things to go differently depending on what agents choose. He would have been very interested in quantum mechanics, not as a magical solution to the problem of free will, he would have been too careful for that, but as evidence that the world at its most fundamental level is not the smooth, determined machine that classical physics had seemed to imply. That genuine randomness, genuine openness, is built into the structure of things, that the block universe in which everything is already settled is not the universe we actually inhabit. He would not have said that quantum indeterminacy proves free will, but he would have said that it is consistent with the kind of universe where genuine novelty, genuine agency, genuine change are possible. And he thought that was enough. Not certainty, but possibility. Not proof, but room. He was also deeply concerned with what philosophy is for. He thought that philosophy had become, in certain academic circles, an increasingly technical enterprise disconnected from the concerns of actual human life. Philosophers were arguing about things that had no bearing on how people lived, loved, suffered, and died, and James thought this was a kind of failure. He thought philosophy ought to be, at its core, a practical enterprise, not practical in the narrow sense of merely useful, but practical in the deep sense of genuinely connected to the texture of lived experience. He thought the great philosophical questions, what is real, what is true, what is good, how should we live, were not puzzles to be solved in seminar rooms and then filed away. They were questions that pressed on every serious human life and that deserved the honest engagement of the best minds. He wrote for ordinary people, not just for specialists. His prose is remarkable, warm, alive, full of metaphor and story and humor. He believed that if an idea is true, it should be possible to say it in a way that a thoughtful non-specialist can understand. He did not believe in the kind of philosophical obscurity that passes for depth. He thought clarity was a virtue, not a sign of shallow thinking. And he modeled that. He wrote about enormous questions with enormous clarity. He did not always arrive at definitive answers, because he thought the questions genuinely do not have definitive answers. But he arrived at something better than a definitive answer. He arrived at a more honest relationship with the question, a more spacious, more courageous, more open way of holding the things we cannot fully know. What can we take from all of this into our own lives? First, take your inner experience seriously. Not uncritically, not without examination, but seriously. The moments of awe and love and grief and grace that you have had are not just noise. They are not just chemistry. They are part of the evidence. They are telling you something. Listen. Second, hold your certainties lightly. This applies whether you are a committed believer or a committed skeptic. James thought the most dangerous people, philosophically and morally, were the ones who had stopped being genuinely curious, who had already decided what the universe was and were only looking for confirmation. Be curious, stay open, be willing to be surprised. Third, choose the strenuous mood. Do not let the uncertainty of ultimate things become an excuse for passivity. The fact that we cannot know with certainty whether the universe is meaningful does not mean the answer is no. And acting as though it means yes, acting with seriousness and courage and care, is not self-deception. It is, James thought, the most honest possible response to the situation we actually find ourselves in. Fourth, take other people's experiences seriously, including experiences very different from your own. The mystic who has had an experience you have never had is not necessarily deluded. The scientist who finds meaning in the elegant structure of mathematics is not necessarily missing something spiritual. The person who prays is not necessarily naive. The person who does not pray is not necessarily shallow. Human beings encounter the real in different ways, and a philosophy large enough to honor that fact is more honest than one that insists everyone must encounter it in the same way. Fifth, be twice born if you have the chance. This is not something you can arrange. You cannot manufacture a shattering. But when it comes, as it comes for most of us sooner or later, do not try to escape it too quickly. Do not immediately reach for the comfort or the explanation or the story that makes it make sense. Sit in it long enough to let it do its work. Because James thought that the transformation it makes possible, the deepening, the opening, the reconstitution of a self that is larger and more supple than the one that was broken, is one of the most genuinely important things that can happen to a human life. And sixth, do not be afraid of the question. Do not be afraid of the uncertainty. The universe is large and strange and genuinely mysterious in ways that no one, not the most brilliant physicist, not the wisest mystic, not the most rigorous philosopher, has fully penetrated. That mystery is not a problem. It is an invitation. It is the most interesting thing about being alive, the fact that we are beings capable of asking questions that the universe so far has not answered, and that we keep asking them anyway, because the asking itself is part of what makes us human. William James was one of the great question askers of all time, not a great question answerer. He was honest enough to know that the great questions do not submit to final answers. But a great question asker, a great invitation extender, a great human being who spent a life of genuine intellectual and moral courage in the presence of the things that matter most, and who wrote about them with such warmth and honesty and grace that his words are still alive and still nourishing more than a century after he first spoke them. He died in 1910 at the age of 68. He had spent his last years in increasing physical pain, but he kept working, he kept writing, he kept showing up to the questions. In his final days, he was still thinking about the things he had thought about his whole life. Consciousness, will, religion, science, the nature of experience, the possibility of something beyond the merely personal. He did not arrive at a final answer. He did not have a deathbed conversion or a deathbed rejection. He died as he had lived, in honest, curious, courageous relationship with the mystery. His friend and colleague John Dewey wrote about him after his death that he was the most alive person he had ever known. Not alive in the sense of vigorous or gregarious, though he was those things too, but alive in the sense of genuinely present to the fullness of experience, genuinely open to what was actually there, genuinely moved by what was genuinely moving. That is the kind of praise worth aspiring to. There is a young man I want to tell you about. He was not famous. He is not in any history book. He was a student, somewhere in the middle of his life, who found himself in a crisis. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that is actually more common and more painful, the slow crisis of not knowing what anything means. He had been raised in a faith tradition that no longer made sense to him, but he had found nothing to replace it with. He had read the science and found it beautiful and unsatisfying in equal measure. He felt, in his own words, like a person standing in a room with no windows and no doors, knowing there must be an outside but unable to find the way to it. And then someone gave him William James, not with any great ceremony, just, here, you might like this. He read it in 3 days. He did not find the answers he was looking for. But he found something better. He found a person who had stood in the same room and had not found the door either, and had said, with full honesty and full warmth, "That is all right. You do not have to find the door. You can live honestly and fully in the uncertainty. You can take your experience seriously without pretending to know more than you do. You can bet on meaning without having proof of it. You can be brave." He put the book down and felt, for the first time in years, that he was not alone. Not because James had given him a community or a creed or a certainty, but because James had given him permission to be exactly where he was, to be genuinely unsure, and to keep going anyway. That is what good philosophy does. That is what this book does. It does not tell you what to believe. It does not tell you that religion is true or that science is complete or that the universe is definitely friendly or definitely indifferent. It tells you something more useful than any of those things. It tells you that the question is real, that your experience of the question is real, that the uncertainty is not a failure of your intelligence but an honest response to an honest situation, and that there is a way to live in that uncertainty with courage, with curiosity, with genuine care for others, and genuine honesty with yourself, that is not just bearable but genuinely rich, genuinely worth the effort. Please like and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely means the world to us. We put real thought and real care into every summary we bring to you, and every person who subscribes helps make it possible for us to keep going. If this summary opened something in you, if it gave you a question or a thought or a feeling that you want to carry further, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who might feel the same. Because these ideas are too good to stay in one place, they deserve to travel. There is one more thing worth saying about William James, and it is perhaps the most personal thing. He believed that the universe needs us, not in a sentimental way, in a genuine, philosophical, almost scientific way. He thought that whatever lies at the heart of things, whatever it is that religious experience touches, whatever it is that the sense of awe and grace and connection is pointing toward, is not complete without human participation. That the universe, in some sense, is working something out, and that we are part of that working out. That what we do, how we live, what we become, these things matter not just to us but to the fabric of things. He thought that belief, genuine, lived, committed belief, in that possibility, is not naive. It is not wishful thinking. It is the most honest possible response to being the kind of creatures we are. Creatures who can ask the question, creatures who can choose, creatures who can love and suffer and create and destroy and begin again. Creatures who, in the very act of asking why, are doing something that no other known entity in the universe does. That is extraordinary. That is worth honoring. That is worth thinking about carefully and honestly and without giving up, for as long as we have the chance. William James gave us the tools to think about it. He gave us the vocabulary and the courage and the permission. He gave us a way of being both rigorous and open, both honest and hopeful, both scientific and spiritual. Not because those things are always easy to hold together, but because they are all genuinely ours. They all belong to the full human inheritance, and claiming the full inheritance, insisting on all of it, refusing to give any of it up, is exactly what James did, and exactly what he invited us to do. So here we are, at the end of a long walk in a large and strange and beautiful universe, holding two lanterns. The room is still mostly dark, but the lanterns are lit. And that, James would say, is enough to take the next step. Thank you for walking this far with us. It has been a genuine privilege to spend this time in the company of ideas that matter, brought to you by a voice and a tradition that believed, fiercely and honestly, in the importance of thinking well about the things that matter most. Please do check out our other videos on this channel. We have a whole library of audiobook summaries and philosophical explorations waiting for you, each one built with the same care and the same commitment to bringing big ideas to life in the most human and honest way we know how. Every video in our library is an invitation. We hope you accept it. And until next time, keep asking the question, keep holding the lanterns, and keep going.